Hello, everybody. Today we have with us Dr. Walter Block. He is the Harold E. Wirth Eminent Scholar Chair in Economics in the College of Business at Loyola University, New Orleans. He's also an adjunct scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute and the Hoover Institute. Mr. Block's previously taught at the University of Central Arkansas, Holy Cross College, and Rutgers University, has a BA in philosophy from Brooklyn College and a PhD in economics from Columbia University. He's also an author of such books as Defending the Undefendable, 1 and 2, among a variety of others. I definitely recommend everyone checking them out sometime. Remember, support brick and mortar bookstores. Anyway, how are you doing this evening, Dr. Block?
Pretty good, thanks. Thanks for having me on your program.
Yeah, no problem. Anyway, so I just had a couple questions I wanted to ask you today. Just regarding your work and your books and everything like that. I have them pulled up right here. But do you think you could begin by telling us a little bit about yourself, the kind of work that you do, and perhaps most importantly, what you consider to be your primary contributions to the fields of economics and political science?
Wow, that's a tough one. I'll try to do my best. I was born in Brooklyn, and I was sort of a leftish person. I was a high school.
We all?
I was a high school buddy of Bernie Sanders, and we were on the track team together. We were sort of buddies, and I had roughly the same views as he did until I met Ayn Rand, who came to lecture at Brooklyn College, and she and her colleagues converted me to a free market perspective. And I've been a free market advocate ever since, and a libertarian.
Okay. What about in terms of contributions to the fields of economics, maybe?
Well, I guess I've made a few. I've published, I don't know, about 600 articles and maybe 25 books and millions, well, not millions, but thousands of op-eds. So I've I don't know if I've made contributions, but I've published on many different issues. Rent control, that was my PhD dissertation. Minimum wage, unions, free trade, business cycle theory, monetary theory, gold standard in economics, and also in libertarian theory on abortion would be one of my areas.
Like your evictionism?
Evictionism would be my view on the pro-life, pro-choice debate. I've done stuff on, what else have I done on animal rights, on, what else have I done in property rights? I've even had there's a Lockean proviso where John Locke said that the way to get to own property is by mixing your labor with it. But the proviso was that you can only do it as long as there's sufficient virgin territory for everybody. And after that, then all bets are off. Well, Stephan Kinsella was kind enough to call one of my theories the Blockian proviso. And I call that my bagel theory, or donut theory. Think of a bagel, which has got a hole in the middle, and then the bagel, and then outside. And are you allowed to are you allowed a homestead in the bagel format, namely leaving the middle open without any homesteading? And my claim was not. You're not allowed to do that. So I've dabbled in many issues in libertarian theory and in economics.
Well, again, it's great to have you on. You're actually you were requested by a lot of my viewers. I have a large libertarian audience. I mean, not particularly large in the greater scheme of things, but you're very popular in my circles. So 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. David Friedman, who's another anarcho-capitalist theorist and the son of the late Dr. Milton Friedman, who of course laid the groundwork for what would become the Chicago School of Neoclassical Economics. And as we know, both the Chicago School, which Friedman subscribes to, and the Austrian School, which is the tradition that you're a part of, are two dominant schools of thought in the realm of libertarian economics. Do you think you could briefly explain the differences between the two schools? And could you also explain the reason that you believe the Austrian school to be a more useful perspective as it pertains to the study and application of economics?
Right. Well, first of all, both of these schools are almost misnamed, but not really. The Austrian school has got nothing to do with the economics of the country Austria, nor does the Chicago school have anything to do with the economics of the city Chicago.
Yeah.
It's just that we're named the Austrian school because the people who started it, Menger, Bombewerk, Mises, Hayek, all came from Austria. And similarly with the Chicago school, it was Milton Friedman and Stigler and Becker and people like that just happened to be at the University of Chicago. So it might be misnamed, but that's the nomenclature. There's a great overlap. Think of a Venn diagram, two circles where there's overlap. We're both known as the free market school of thought, as opposed to the Keynesian school or the socialist school of economics. So there's a great overlap on. Gary Becker was my dissertation advisor, and my dissertation was on rent control, and he was my guide and my mentor. And we have no real disagreements about the effects of rent control. So there's a lot of overlap, say free trade, a minimum wage, rent control, economics of discrimination, which Gary Becker was very important in producing. So there's a lot of overlap. But where we diverge, I go in the Austrian direction, not in the Chicagoan direction. So where do we diverge? Well, there's also there's normative and positive economics.
Yeah.
On the positive side, they favor the concept of market failure. Market failure would be monopoly and externalities and public goods and inequality and transactions costs and things like that. Whereas the true blue Austrian, such as myself, I'm a Rothbardian on this and many other things, don't really agree with the notion of market failure. We think there ain't no such thing as a market failure. There is government failure, but not market failure. Now, none of the people say that market failure is like going broke. You open a store and you go broke. Market failure would be where the government can fix things and they can't fix
too big to fail, that sort of thing.
Right. So where do we disagree? Now Milton Friedman is actually not so bad on antitrust. He says that monopoly misallocates resources, and then you have the famous deadweight loss. And Friedman makes the very good point that, yes, there's a deadweight loss, but if the costs of fixing it are greater than the misallocative effects of the deadweight loss, then you shouldn't have any antitrust policy on those cases, which is very sensible. But in my view, there ain't no deadweight loss in the first place. It's just an exercise in interpersonal comparison of utility, which is invalid. So that would be one area where we disagree. Another area where we disagree is Milton Friedman once said, we're all Keynesians now. Well, we Austrians ain't all Keynesians. The mainstream is, and the mainstream would include Chicago and the Keynesian economists. So I see the big difference between Friedman, a right-wing Keynesian who believes in monetary theory as the solution, and the left-wing Keynesian, say like Samuelson, who believe in fiscal policy.
Like Krugman, would he be another good example? Yeah.
Left-wing Keynesian, but the Chicago people are right-wing Keynesian, but they're still Keynesians, and the Austrians would reject the whole idea that the market is unstable, and we think the reason business cycles occur is because the artificial lowering of interest rates, which leads to unsustainable long-run investments. So there are differences there. But I think the big difference is over praxeology. The way the mainstream Chicagoans are logical positivists. The way they see economics is they sort of have physics envy. For them, economics is purely an empirical science. You have a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, and if the hypothesis works out, you tentatively accept it. But there are no economic laws. Even rent control is not a law. A law means there are no exceptions. Whereas for Austrians, there are economic laws. There's praxeology, and there ain't no such thing as evidence. There are illustrations, but not evidence. For example, you bought a pair of glasses. You paid $200 for that pair of glasses. I deduce that you valued those glasses at more than $200 when you bought them. So ex ante, you necessarily gain. And you can't test that. You can't refute that. There's no way to falsify that. Whereas Friedman would say, well, this is religious. And he doesn't mean religious in a positive way. He means religious in a cultish way.
Okay.
And there are people that say Austrianism is a cult. I once invited Jim Buchanan to.
Big influence of mine. Public choice theory, all that.
He also favors 100% tax on inheritance. But
I disagree with that part. But yeah,
that's the side. I invited him, and you invite somebody to speak, and you don't want to ambush them. I disagreed with him on certain things, but I figured my students and my colleagues would enjoy interacting with him. And right in the middle of one of his speeches, he says, well, Austrianism is a cult. And he was sort of going on, and I lost it. I I lost it, and I gave a 10-minute diatribe, and I expected him to, get back at me, but he just ignored it.
But just a question about Dr. Buchanan. So I've read like Calculus of Consent, like in his work on public choice, but what school of economics would he have subscribed to? Because I mean, he's definitely not Austrian. He seems Austrian adjacent in some ways, but he's not quite Chicago either.
Well, he's a lot closer to Chicago. I mean, he's very good on, subjective costs.
Okay.
Austrianism is sometimes known as the subjectivist school. That would be a good a good synonym for Austrianism. Hayek once said that if you understand, I don't remember the exact quote, but the essence of Austrianism is subjectivism. So he was subjectivist in cost. His book, Cost and Choice, was really, really good. But then his whole public choice stuff is just highly problematic. I have a book out with Tom DiLorenzo, and we just ripped into public choice.
Yeah, I think I remember that one. Yeah.
One of the things that really ticks me off about it is, what is this rent seeking? There ain't no rent seeking, it's booty seeking. And what they mean by rent seeking is, in effect, theft. And they don't make a distinction, a normative distinction between theft and ordinary market interaction. So unsophisticated are they? But I wanted to get back to praxeology. Let me tell you a little story about Gary Becker. Gary Becker was my dissertation advisor, and he was certainly a Friedmanite or a Chicagoite. Yeah. And I was doing econometric regression equations on rent control, and my independent variable was how much rent control did the city have. They all had rent control in 1941. And in 46, a whole bunch of them got rid of rent control. And in 47 and 48 and 50 and 52. So various cities got rid of rent control. New York City kept it. So I had a good independent variable, namely how many years did a city have rent control? And then my dependent variable was the quality of housing, holding constant everything else I could think of that might affect quality of housing, like wealth and weather and God knows what. So most of the times I got good signs on my independent variable, namely the more rent control, the lousier the housing, holding everything constant. And I usually got, significance at the 5% level. But every once in a while, I got the wrong sign. And every once in a while, the wrong sign was statistically significant. So if Gary Becker were really a Chicagoite, what he would have said is, block you, moron. No, sorry. He would have said, oh, I've got this genius block. Young kid. I was a young kid then. I'm not a young kid anymore. He would have said, I've got this genius block who's going to overturn everything we know about rent control. But he didn't say that. In effect, and instead he said, he didn't say block you, moron, but that was what he was thinking.
Blockhead.
Go out and do it again until you get it right. Then you get how important that is. You see, according to the mainstream, my econometric was testing the hypothesis that rent control leads to housing disarray.
I do have a question about rent control, though, because one of my majors was econ as well. And I remember I wrote an essay, I think it was like a 20, 30-page essay on rent control, arguing how it was unconstitutional under the Third Amendment. What would you have to say about that in terms of quartering, in a sense, because it's basically, they're not soldiers, but I mean, it's still the government more or less forcing people to live inside your property. And you have all of these in New York, these apartment buildings that have been like that people own have been in these people's families for generations, yet they also, the people who are living inside them have also been living there for generations, because there's no way for them to get rid of them, and they're paying rent way lower than what it's worth. And it's honestly, it's kind of screwed up.
Absolutely. You're quite right. Rent control is really a big mess for housing. It's, if your Aunt Tilly leaves you $1 million and you can invest in residential rental units or other commercial real estate, or in shoes or socks or lima beans, well, all those things are free. Free of regulation. So you're going to have less investment in new building if you have rent control. So it's going to hurt people. And also, you're quite right. It's quartering people. Now, Richard Epstein had a book called Takings. And I think this is a taking. Namely, you're taking from, you're taking without compensating landlords who could rent for $1,500 a month, and now they're renting for $200 a month. So you're really taking $1,300 a month away from them and giving it to the tenant who's lucky enough to get there before the housing disarray. But I wanted to get back to me and Gary Becker. You see, according to the Chicagoans, what I was doing is testing what we really know to be true about rent control, namely that it retards investment and creates landlord-tenant problems and the rest of the mess. I was testing that, and if my econometric stuff came out with the wrong result, well, then we have to start rethinking our views on rent control. But what Gary Becker said was, go out and do it again until you get it right. So in other words, he knew what he if you scratch a good Chicagoan, you're going to get an Austrian. And Gary Becker was a very good economist, and you scratch him and you get an Austrian. And what I tried to do to convince him was he's really an Austrian, because he didn't for a moment believe that I was testing this theory. I was just illustrating it, and sometimes my illustrations were right and sometimes they were wrong. But we know, I mean, just basic supply and demand, when you have a price below equilibrium, a regulation price below equilibrium, demand is greater than supply and you have a shortage. End of case. And this other example I gave you, that we both bought eyeglasses for $200, and we valued them at 201 or more, namely more than 200, and therefore we necessarily gained. Well, you can't test that. Well, then it's a cult. And Gary Becker said Austrianism was a cult. And I try to.
I don't see how. I mean, I feel like a lot of. I just feel like, especially in the modern era specifically, you have all of these other alternative ways of doing things that are outside of the consensus, even things that have proven in the past to be adequate means of explaining things, that are completely written off as like pseudoscientific in a lot of like, for instance, kind of how in the realm of philosophy, basically nobody takes metaphysics seriously anymore either. So I guess that's kind of a interesting parallel.
Well, I mean, you started asking me, where do the Austrians diverge from the Chicagoans? And where they diverge is that the Chicagoans are committing a logical contradiction.
Like hyper-empiricism, positivism.
Yes, they are logical positivists, and they are committing a logical contradiction by saying, on the one hand, you have to test all hypotheses, and on the other hand, saying, well, do it until you get it right. Well, do it until you get it right means we know what the right answer is. And all you can do is illustrate it, which is the Austrian view. So I think that's the main difference. But then there are many other kind of differences. They believe in, what do you call it? Not ordinal utility, cardinal utility. They believe in cardinal utility. They have indifference curves. Indifference curves are incompatible with sense, because human action is one of preference. If you value those eyeglasses at 200 and the price was 200, you would be indifferent between them. You would never act if you were indifferent. The only time you act, Mises tells us, is to make the future a little bit better, or better than it would otherwise be had you not acted. Namely, all you can do is exhibit preference. You can never exhibit indifference. So, but they live and die by indifference, and they live and die by cardinal utility. Look, I'm rich. and you're poor, and we're on the same marginal utility curve of wealth, and you take $1,000 away from me, and I lose just a little bit of utils, and you are a poor guy, and you gain a lot of utils, and therefore there's a case to have income redistribution. That's true; it costs something, and there are negative incentive effects. But forget about that. The Chicagoans will buy into that crap. Whereas the Austrians say, yes, you have ordinal utility. I prefer this to that. I prefer the glasses to the 200. I prefer the green sweater behind my head to not having the green sweater.
Because we as individuals are the ones who decide what is of value to us.
Right.
Yeah. Like, for instance, it's like if I have there's somebody special to me who gave me a birthday card, for instance, and I value that over the expensive coat I'm wearing right now.
Sure. Well, I think the Chicagoans, to give them credit, would be able to incorporate that into their analysis as well. But they're not. And then they have this transitivity nonsense, that if now look, I'm in favor of transitivity for numbers. If 8 is bigger than 7 and 7 is bigger than 6, then 8 is bigger than 6. Fine. But if I prefer apples to bananas and bananas to carrots, it doesn't mean that I prefer apples to carrots. I could change my mind. Whereas their economics can't incorporate that. So we Austrians have a lot of criticisms of the mainstream Chicagoans. But on the other hand, we do overlap with them a lot more than, Krugman. I sometimes criticize Milton Friedman, and my friend Bill Barnett says, well, under whose rule would you rather live, Friedman or Krugman? And well,
I like Friedman.
I'll take Friedman.
No, but so this reminds me back to, and it was actually one of the first videos I posted on my channel. It was just like a clip from, it was a clip.
Let me interrupt you again. I can only see half your face now. You have to move. That's better. Now I can see.
I'm trying to lean into my mic though too, so we have good.
Move your camera. You don't see yourself?
No, I see myself.
Okay. Now I can see your whole head except your forehead. You're cut off right there. So you have to get.
I need to get an actual camera.
Now I can see you. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. Continue.
Yeah, no. So one of the first videos I ended up actually posting up to my channel. It was just a re-upload. It was a talk between Hayek and Jim Buchanan, where Hayek was basically talking about how modern economics, it's all scientism, more or less. And I would agree that's a very accurate way of basically they're turning empirical methodology into their mythology.
Right. Before you talked about being canceled, Apple and Amazon are canceling all sorts of people, but I don't think anything we've said, well, then a lot of people didn't think anything they said would be cancelable, but I really don't think anything we said now would be considered something where they could cancel us.
No. That's not what it was. It was more so I haven't showed my face yet on my YouTube channel, and I don't know if I like that's really what it was. So yeah.
I'm sort of leery now of discussing race or sex or anything like that, or discussing Donald Trump, because you can get canceled nowadays. But to discuss technical issues of Austrian economics and Chicago economics, I don't think even any of the most progressive people are going to say, well, that's incendiary, or that's, I don't know.
You never know in like 10 years, maybe.
Oh, maybe it'll be offensive in 10 years, but hopefully right now we're not going to get canceled.
So next question I have for you. So prior to your becoming a market anarchist, you stated that you considered yourself to be more of a classical liberal in the vein of like F.A. Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, John Stuart Mill, those guys. What made you change your position on the legitimacy of state power? And what is your argument as to why somebody should become an anarchist as opposed to a minarchist?
Well, in 2 words, Murray Rothbard. It's all his fault. I blame him. No,
so that took 5 minutes for him to convert you, right?
It took more like 10 minutes. I read Hazlitt's Economics 1 lesson, which I use now for my intro courses. And Henry Hazlitt was saying, well, why do we have pretty good shoes? Well, because we have markets. And if you don't make good shoes, you're going to lose money. And if you keep not making good shoes, you're going to have to go into some other business. And Murray said, well, why shouldn't that apply to police or armies or courts or whatever? And he converted me very quickly. It took me like 2 years to get into Austrian economics. He tried to convert me to Austrian economics.
What were you before that? Were you
I was
Keynesian?
a mainstream Chicagoite.
Okay.
The idea that you could have a synthetic a priori statement, something that is absolutely true and not a tautology, it just sort of blew my mind. But now I've given you several tautology, well, not tautology, several synthetic a prioris, namely trade, voluntary trade is mutually beneficial.
Mhm.
Minimum wage law will create unemployment for anyone whose productivity is below the level stipulated by the law. These are all synthetic a prioris, namely they are absolutely necessarily true. The denial of them is a logical contradiction, and yet they tell us about the real world. I just couldn't get my thick head through that. But Murray Rothbard, now, you mentioned the word anarchism, and, people start thinking, oh, you're going to bomb somebody or something like that. Well, Murray and I and most libertarian anarchists are more philosophical anarchists. We don't
Yeah.
have any violence. We're just talking about theory.
Yeah, like I know Tom Woods, for example, pragmatically, he's like a Jeffersonian Democrat type, but philosophically,
without the slavery part.
Without the slavery part, yeah. However, I've definitely seen people in what he calls the loser brigade trying to spin some things to make it seem like he's, yeah. But no, I'm a big fan of Tom. So.
Oh, I'm a big fan of his as well. I've been on his show 4 or 5 times.
So yeah, what's your argument as to why somebody should be an anarchist as opposed to a minarchist, at least in the philosophical sense?
Well, the problem is that the government taxes you, and taxes are involuntary payments. And
Okay.
if I were to come up to you and say, look, I'm starting this club, and we're going to protect you and this and that and the other, and pay me some money, and you might say, well, thanks for the offer, but I'm okay as is. And if I were the government, I would say, hey, you don't understand. You have to pay me this. Well, we have a word for compulsory payment, and it's called theft. So the government necessarily is a thief. And all the services that the government provides can be provided by free enterprise. So that would be one argument. Another argument is the case in favor of the government is that you and I might get into a fight, and we need the government to make sure we behave.
Yeah.
Well, if that's true, because we're right now in a state of anarchy with each other without a government, so the government has to step in and make sure that you and I behave. We don't punch each other, we behave. Well, what is the relationship of Albania and Argentina right now? It's one of anarchism. Namely, there is no world government overlooking both of them.
Yep, and that's why I've always said international. Like I'm a realist in terms of like international relations. For example, there's really no such thing as the international community. It's a very anarchic place.
Right, right. But you see, if you really believe in government, then you have to believe in world government. And very few minarchists, classical liberals, believe in world government. Look, I'm Jewish. In history, before Israel was created, we're always running from one place to another.
Yeah.
They don't like us here, we run there. They kill us here, we go there. Whatever.
I mean, it's been like that for like 4,000 years about.
Yes, I think that's right. But if there was world government, there'd be no place to go. I mean, the moon and Mars might be hospitable in 10 to 30, 50 years from now, but right now, the only places on Earth. And look, if we had world government and it was based on, what do you call it, democratic principles, well, India and China between them would pretty much run the whole world. Well, I'm not too happy with the Chinese government or the Indian government. With all of its flaws, I vastly prefer the U.S. government to those two, and yet they would be running things. But the idea here is that minarchists and limited government libertarians are committing a logical contradiction if they don't favor world government. None of them favor world government, so therefore they're have a fallacious view.
So yeah, my question to that is, and so for instance, I'm more of a minarchist, and this is more of my philosophically I'd say voluntarist, but pragmatically a like classical liberal minarchist. But my one criticism I know of sort of any form of anarchy, and maybe you could you could answer this for me because you've been within this tradition for decades. But in the absence of any kind of state, what is to stop a state from forming? Like, is it possible we'll just end up going back to square one in a sense? Because you might have like, I don't know, like let's say you have Walt Disney or something. This is a dumb example, but like Disney or something, and they end up buying up all these swaths of land, and they create sort of like a corporate state in a sense. Isn't that basically just a government?
Well, what you're really saying, what you're really asking is, would anarchism be sustainable? Would it, or would it revert back to statism? Well, we do have some empirical evidence for this, namely that if this were true, if there was this necessary impetus toward amalgamation, well, how many countries in the world do we have?
Like 300 something?
Now around 300, 280, something like that. So if this fear of yours were true, if this impetus were true, we'd have fewer and fewer and fewer governments, and eventually we'd have one, a world government. But we don't see that. We see stability. I mean, Monaco is still a country, even though it's weak. Luxembourg is still an independent country, even though it's weak, compared to other stronger countries. So if your fear were reasonable, we would expect it to operate not only within the United States under an anarchic situation, but also around the world.
Okay.
Another argument for anarchism, again, I'm going to try to convert you out of minarchism and limited government libertarianism. And, there are really three, how shall I say, foundations of libertarianism. One is the non-aggression principle, keep your mitts off of other people. And second one is private property.
Yeah.
And the third one is free association. Nobody should be compelled to associate with anyone else against their will.
That's like that's my like main problem with like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, because it took away kind of the freedom of association aspect.
Absolutely. But now look, suppose California wants to secede from the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no issue of slavery. Okay, there was an issue of slavery in 1861 when certain states wanted to secede. But people in California are now talking about secession. Well, and we don't have any slavery, and there's not going to be any slavery in California if they secede. Do they have a right to secede? Well, yeah, if they don't like the rest of us, and we believe in free association, they should not be compelled to associate with us. Look, the only problem with slavery and rape is that they violated the free association. The slave didn't want to associate with the slave owner. The rape victim doesn't want to associate with the rapist. And they were compelled to associate. So
it goes down to respect of property, and your body is like the ultimate property, more or less.
Yeah.
And so
that's
why. So for instance, evictionism, for example, that's a more or less the theory. I think it was you, and who else was it? It was another. Either way, for evictionism, this is, I think, where you've influenced me the most personally, Dr. Block, because that is the single most logically consistent argument in favor of pro-choice that I've ever heard.
Well, thank you. But I just wanted to finish up this minarchism business. Suppose California wants to secede from the U.S. Do they have the right to do it? Yes. Now, suppose Los Angeles wants to secede from California. Do they have a right to do it? Yes. Now, suppose a certain neighborhood in Los Angeles wants to secede from Los Angeles. Do they have a right to do it? Yes. Now, suppose a city block wants to secede from the neighborhood in Los Angeles. Do they have a right? Yes. Now, suppose an individual wants to secede. Well, the anarchist position is we should have 7 billion countries, one for each. And if you ask a girl for a date, you can't ask her for a date. You have to get your foreign minister to ask our foreign minister if you can have a date. I'm just kidding about that. But the ideal anarcho-capitalist view is 7 billion sovereign people. We should all be sovereign. Nobody should compel us to do anything, like pay taxes. Now, on this evictionism, let me talk a little bit about that. Evictionism and immigration and voluntary slavery are three issues where libertarians, even Rothbardians, disagree. For example, on abortion, you have Ron Paul, who is
pro-life.
He doesn't walk on water. He runs on water. He floats above it. He's Saint Ron Paul. He is a pro-life person. Murray Rothbard, who is equally a leader of our group, is pro-choice. They're 180 degrees apart. Mm-hmm. So happily, I concocted this thing called evictionism, which is a compromise position, but a principled compromise position. So, for example, if you think 2 + 2 is 4 and I think 2 + 2 is 6, Well, a compromise would be 2 plus 2 is 5, but that's an unprincipled compromise because it doesn't deduce, you can't deduce 2 plus 2 equals 5 from any principle. It's just a compromise. So it's not a principled one, but this is a principled one. You see, there are really 2 issues. The problem is that abortion really means 2 things: 1, evicting, and 2, killing.
Mm-hmm.
Pro-choice people think you can evict the baby from the womb at any time, and you can also kill the baby at any time. Whereas the pro-life people say you can't do either. You can't evict and you can't kill. The compromise position for the evictionist position, my position is you can do one of these 2, but not both. Namely, you can evict, but you can't kill. Now, what is the fetus? As far as when does life start? As far as I'm concerned, life starts with a fertilized egg.
Oh yeah, I mean, like it's because I think we need to make a distinction between life and personhood in a sense, and that's why
personhood starts with the fertilized egg. Personhood. That fertilized egg is a person, and that fertilized egg has every rights that you and I have. But that because the sperm alone will not become a human being, and the egg alone will not become a human being, but the fertilized egg is a very young human being. Okay, now Murray says, well, life starts at birth. But as far as I'm concerned, the baby 1 hour before birth and the baby 1 hour after birth, the same baby. It's just like you and I an hour ago, and now we're the same person as we were an hour ago. It's the same thing with the baby. So birth is just a change of address. Okay, so now what's going on? Take the case of rape. Woman is walking down the street, woman gets grabbed, the woman gets impregnated, and now there's a trespasser, a human being who's a trespasser inside of her. Now, it would be nice, it would be decent, it would be generous if she allowed this innocent trespasser to live in her body for 9 months. But libertarianism says, it's her property. She's the owner of that property. She homesteaded that body. She's 25 years old. She's been homesteading that body for 25 years. The baby just is a fertilized egg, and it's 1 day old now. It's a trespasser.
Parasitical, basically.
Parasitical if she doesn't want the baby.
Yeah.
If she welcomes it, then it's not parasitical. But right now it's parasitical. She has a right to evict it, but not to kill the baby, because the baby is innocent. However, if the only way she can evict the baby is to kill it, well, then it's too bad. Look, if suppose now let's take ordinary sexual intercourse. I invite you to my house, and we have dinner, and and you keep hanging around, and now it's 10 o'clock, and I got to go to sleep, and I say, well, it's been nice having you, but please leave. And you say, well, if I leave, there's this group out there that's going to kill me, so I'm going to stay here for 9 months. Well, you're a trespasser. Now, if I were a nice guy, I would keep you for 9 months. But, I don't have to. It's not an obligation of mine. So I think that the compromise position is that you can evict the trespasser. And now another argument against me is, well, how about voluntary sexual intercourse? Isn't there a contract between the mother and the baby? When you engage in voluntary sexual intercourse, aren't you inviting in the baby? Well, first of all, just because I invited you into my house doesn't mean I have to keep you for 9 months. But secondly, even more powerfully, remember I said the fertilized egg is the human being. Before the fertilized egg, there's no human being. Well, let me explain biology of sexual intercourse. It takes a half hour or 5 hours for the sperm to get up the fallopian tubes or whatever tubes there are to fertilize the egg. So at the time of intercourse, look, if you're going to have a contract, you have to have 2 people having the contract. Forget about the father. Is there a contract between the mother and the baby such that the invitation is counted as a contract? Shouldn't be a contract in the first place, but suppose the invitation were a contract. There's no contract because the baby doesn't exist at the time of intercourse. The baby only comes alive an hour later. So there can be no objection to my thesis on the ground that the mother invited in the baby. The only time that you shouldn't have the eviction would be a host mother. Me and my wife, say, are infertile for some reason, and we hire some woman to bear the baby. Well, now she can't evict because we paid her $100,000 to keep that baby, so she can't kill the baby.
It's a contract at that point, yeah.
Contract, but there's no other case of a contract. So I think that the eviction thesis is correct, And happily, it's the only compromise position to pro-life and pro-choice. Now, in my heart of hearts, I'm pro-life. I like babies. I like human beings. Some of my best friends are human beings. I want human beings to survive. And I notice that we pro-life people are really losing, because right now, you can have abortion, right up until the 9-month period. But and also the baby is viable outside of the womb in the 3rd trimester, the 7th, 8th, and 9th month. But as medical technology increases, the thing will become earlier and earlier. In maybe 10, 20 years, the baby might be viable in the 6th month. Yeah. In 50 years, it might be in the 5th month. You know it. In 500 years from now, if we don't blow ourselves up before then, the baby will be viable on day 1 outside the womb.
And they can keep it like in some kind of incubator or something.
Yeah. Incubator, test tube, whatever, keep the baby alive. But so if we adopt evictionism, eventually all babies will be saved. Yeah. Whereas if we stick our head in the sand and we pro-lifers stick our head in the sand and say, no, pro-life, well, even in 500 years, when all babies could be viable, we'll still have abortions. And abortion means eviction plus killing.
Yeah. So, but what I find interesting too is and I don't think they're aware that they're doing this, but you have people on the left, particularly, I mean, it's generally a kind of a feminist argument these days, but the whole my body, my choice, that sort of thing. So I feel like they don't realize that they're basically making a property rights argument when a lot of them don't like the idea of property rights to begin with.
We should legalize prostitution, because if a woman owns her body and she wants to rent it out, not as an accountant or as a typist, but as a sexual object, she should have a right. It's her body. But she has no right to kill trespassers who are innocent. She has only the right to evict. Whereas the feminists say, well, I don't want that man's baby to be alive, the rapists say. Or even divorced a woman, but she has no right to say that. She only has a right to evict the baby from her body because it's her body. But you're quite right; they are making a very profoundly important private property rights position. So if we can just get them to extrapolate from that, they'll all become libertarians.
Yeah. So it's undeniable that the most important libertarian thinker of the past half century would be your late friend and colleague, Murray Rothbard. Do you think that you could talk a little bit about what it was like to work with him? And additionally, what would you say his biggest contribution was to the development of modern libertarian and or economic theory in general?
The big problem I had with Murray was stomach cramps. He was so funny. He kept you in stitches for hour after hour after hour. It was just
Seeing his lectures, seems like a funny guy.
Oh, lectures is one thing. I'm sitting in his living room with 4 or 5 other people, and he's just having us in stitches. So that's my big criticism, Murray. Laughter. I mean, he was just so funny, so witty. It was just a pleasure. I think one of his you say, what are his biggest contributions? I mean, encyclopedic. But what I would say is what he did, he was properly called the father of libertarianism or Mr. Libertarian. What he did is he got 3 things together. One was economics, where we're sort of like conservatives. The conservatives aren't too bad on economics. But then he combined that with personal liberties, legalizing drugs, legalizing prostitution, where the left is not so bad and the right is horrible. And then he also combined that with foreign policy, namely non-interventionism, peace, which both the left and the right are a bunch of warmongering fanatics. So I think one of Murray's big contributions was putting libertarianism together, namely combining the 3 legs of libertarianism, namely economics, personal liberties, and foreign policy.
Yeah, Henry Hazlitt, who was a classical liberal, but also I'm pretty sure he was somewhat hawkish too, at least from certain things I've read.
Yes. There were, there were people that were a little bit hawkish, and now Murray favored defense. The NBA is now on, and everyone yells defense when the other team has the ball. They can distinguish defense and offense. But the U.S. has, 800 military bases and 130 countries?
Yeah, 850 worldwide, 7 in Iraq alone, 9,000 soldiers.
They call it defense? you know,
half of them are in Europe too. It's like, why do we need to be? I made a video about that for my channel.
And then, you know, Russia put in one foreign military base in Cuba, and everyone got apoplectic. I mean, how can the Russians do that? But the U.S. had military bases all around Russia. So that's one contribution of Murray. Another contribution is man, economy, and state. I mean, man, economy, and state was magnificent. I mean, it just put it all together. It put Austrian economics all together. Give you just one example, and not just economics. He had one line about blackmail, that blackmail should not be a crime. And I wrote maybe 15 articles about that. And
I hear a ringing somewhere.
I don't know how to shut it off, but it'll go away eventually. I must have written 15 articles about blackmail, and then I have a whole book out on blackmail. So what I'm always saying is that Murray Rothbard stole a lot of my ideas. It's true he published in 20 years before I thought of them, but still, he's a thief. He stole my ideas. Namely, you know, they say that people accomplish things because they stand on the shoulders of geniuses who went before them. Well, Murray stood on the shoulders of Mises, and me and a lot of other people stand on the shoulders of Murray Rothbard. A lot of the other people are associated with the Mises Institute. People like Hans Hoppe and Guido.
I'm actually reading A Short History of Man right now. Or
Okay,
listening to it on audio, but yeah.
Okay, great. So Murray is just a phenom. He's what's the word I'm looking for? Where you write about everything under the sun. Renaissance man. He wrote about economics.
Renaissance man, yeah.
He was an expert in many, many fields: history, economics, philosophy.
Very productive too. Extraordinarily productive.
He I don't know. He wrote maybe. I mean, Man, Economy, and State is I don't know how many pages, 800 pages or something like that. And his history of the United States in 4 or 5 volumes. Well, 4 volumes is another 1,000 pages. And then his contribution to LouRockwell.com and the Mises Institute. And
then I think he wrote like what's considered the definitive economic history and analysis. I think it was the crisis of 1819.
Yes. That was his PhD dissertation.
Okay.
So he's made magnificent contributions to I don't know 5, 6, 8 different fields. And I mean, his major fields were libertarian theory and economics. And by the way, I have to say that I'm like him in a lot of ways. We're both Jewish. We're both short and fat. We both got PhDs from Columbia. We're both from New York City. We both married Christian girls who were taller than us. What else?
Mises Institute.
We're both involved with the Mises Institute. I should have written down all the other ways that I'm like Murray. We both have a sense of humor, both Jewish. I don't know. I just can't say enough about Murray. The Reader's Digest used to have this thing, my most unforgettable character. Murray is my most unforgettable character. Whenever I do anything that I'm proud of, I think of him up there somewhere smiling down at me. Now, this is not to say we don't have some disagreements, but here again is something else I have to compliment Murray on. You know, a lot of leaders, you disagree with them and they kick you out, like Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was the leader of the objectivist movement. You disagree with her on one minor detail, you're out. I disagree with Murray on voluntary slavery, on Israel, on several other on evictionism, just to mention 3 or 4 things. And he never came within a million miles of any of that. Now, a lot of people broke with him, but he didn't break with anyone as far as I can see. He
very pragmatic too, willing to make alliances with like, for instance, I remember, so my favorite one of his I read, so sort of half historical, half autobiographical too, The Betrayal of the American Right. It talks about how in the 60s and 70s, even though of course he was still economically libertarian, he actually considered himself a left-wing Democrat at the time.
Well, he made alliances. I don't think he considered himself a left-wing.
I thought there was like a line in the book where he said, then I realized I was a left-wing Democrat. He may have been tongue-in-cheek, but
there was one experience I had with him. Let me mention two. I have a friend, Michael Edelstein, who is a psychologist, and his main guru is Albert Ellis. One time, the four of us got together at Albert Ellis's office, me and my mentor, Murray Rothbard, and my friend Michael and Albert Ellis, and we sang rational songs, and that was a blast. Another thing is there was this Peace and Freedom Party that we try to get out of the Vietnam War. And there were maybe 80% Trotskyites and 19% progressive labor.
That's strange because the Trotskyites then went on to become the neoconservatives.
Yes, the Trots became neocons, but at that time they were Trotskyites, and then there was progressive labor, which was communist, and then us. And we had about 10 people, and the progressive labor maybe had 100, and the Trotskyites had maybe 900 or something like that. And I remember, Murray would make alliances with the left. He would make alliances with the right.
The paleo movement, the paleo strategy too.
It doesn't mean he's a right winger. He's a libertarian. He's not a right, not a left. I believe that he's neither right nor left. He's a libertarian. The left-right spectrum is nonsense. Yeah. It puts Hitler on the right and Stalin on the left, and there's not a dime's worth of difference between them. And it puts, Mother Teresa is a leftist right near buddy Stalin, which is ludicrous.
To move on to something far more speculative, in your most recent book, I think it was your most recent book, Space Capitalism, you discuss possibilities for space exploration and colonization from a free market perspective. Would you mind describing some of the ideas and strategies that you proposed in the book? And additionally, and I know you and I both know the answer to this, but how exactly would these free market endeavors be more successful than, say, organized supranational or state-run projects in building our hypothetical space empire?
Well, the market is always more efficient than government because if you don't do a good job, you automatically go broke unless you're bailed out, but then that's not part of the free enterprise system. The way my co-author and I, Nelson, looked at this, there were really two aspects. One aspect is the getting spaceships up to the moon and to Mars, and you could see that Elon Musk, it used to be the government would shoot up a rocket and that would be it. The rocket would be gone. Imagine you take a plane from New Orleans to New York, and after that one trip, you have to get rid of the plane. You know how expensive plane travel would be? So Elon Musk came up with a system where you could reuse the rockets, which is, reasonable. The second aspect was when we get there, we have the Law of the Sea Treaty where the oceans are supposed to be the common heritage of all mankind. They're trying to pull that crap on the moon and Mars. No, what we should do is use the Lockean Rothbardian homesteading theory that if you go to the moon or you go to Mars, you occupy 10 square miles, well, you're the owner of it. Whereas the way they're doing it now is, Russia would own this part, China would own that part, the United States would own that part. So what we're trying to do is apply privatization to the moon and Mars. Another book that I did
as another libertarian once said, the moon is a harsh mistress.
Oh, magnificent book.
Honestly, I've actually, so a lot of people disagree with, but I'd even argue Starship Troopers has very libertarian themes in it too. In some regards.
Well, if it's defense,
that's what it was. Yeah,
it was defense, and there's nothing wrong with military. Murray Rothbard was not a pacifist. If someone is attacking us, whether from Mars or from wherever, you fight back. Look, it's been great with you, but it's an hour now, so let's call a halt to this. But I really enjoyed it, and let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. I'd definitely like to talk to you again. It was a real pleasure. All right. Goodbye, Dr. Block.
Bye.